my name is Emily Bondor, and I'm located in Santa Cruz, California, so kind of just a little bit south of San Francisco on the coast. I have been beekeeping now for about 12 years. So I had a really fun entry to beekeeping, not from a family of apiarists or bee farmers, anything like that. I was living and working on this permaculture farm on the island of Maui in Hawaii. We were like a diversified fruit and vegetable farm, and as part of the farm we also had chickens, and we had beehives. And there was a beekeeper that would come and do kind of like a couple mini lessons with us, and we would help him build equipment. And that was sort of my first time getting into a beehive, and of course got a bee in my hair and ran away and got a sting on my scalp and the whole thing. And, but then at the end of that little session, we had all this fresh honeycomb right out of the hive. And, there's really nothing better than that. And then that beekeeper, he was starting a business raising queen bees. And he said, I need young eyes for grafting. And at that point, I only knew grafting for like fruit tree grafting or in medical situations. So I didn't even know what grafting in beekeeping was. I was pretty much brand new, but yeah, just basically got started raising queen bees and doing, kind of rearing queens and doing starter finisher hives and really technical queen rearing stuff right off the bat. And I just totally nerded out and got really interested. So yeah, just got bitten by the bug. I was in Hawaii for about a year. And during that time that I was working, raising queens, the beekeeper in Hawaii, his name's Paul Apau. He knew this beekeeper from the Napa Valley, whose name is Rob Keller, who owns Napa Valley Bee Company. And so Rob came out for a visit, and, we were out in the bee yard catching queens and doing the whole thing. And Rob is really fun. He, kind of came to beekeeping through art, and he was just sort of a little bit of like a eccentric, as many beekeepers are. And so he was really a nice guy, and I started following him on his Instagram and kind of seeing what he was up to. And so I knew that he was in the Napa Valley. I had been in the Bay Area before going to Hawaii, and I ended up, moving back. And I was in Santa Cruz, which is a couple hours away from Napa. But, I reached out and said, hey, I want to come up, kind of see what you're up to. So started working with him. Basically did a volunteer event with him. And then he said, do you want to work for me? And I was like, you live like 2.5 hours away. I don't know how that's going to work. But basically went up once a week and would stay overnight one night and did like a bee apprenticeship. I did that for several years. So it's almost similar to like, going into like a graduate school program, but basically doing like a one-on-one apprenticeship with an experienced beekeeper. So that was really a very valuable learning experience. In terms of kind of the evolution of where I got to where I am now with my beekeeping business and kind of the work that I'm doing, I would say that it started in Hawaii, and that was really where I got interested. That was kind of like an incubation time of a lot of learning, exploration, developing the interest. And then when I moved back to the Bay Area, that was when I was, about like a year into beekeeping. So still very new. And at that point, that really, I feel, catapulted me, because I went from a smaller scale queen rearing operation, not always in beehives every day, to then when I would go and work in Napa, it was, multiple different hives in different locations, kind of micro apiaries. So really getting that experience. And I think for a lot of new beekeepers, you might have a backyard hive and you really only have that one sort of data point to draw from of what is your genetics of your beehive, how are you managing it? Every colony is different. And so since I was working in, probably 60 different hives on a monthly basis, that really increased my knowledge base for just understanding how the environment plays a role, how different genetics play a role, kind of learning different aspects of hive management with a bee mentor. And then at the same time, I was also meeting beekeepers in the Santa Cruz area where I was. We have a beekeeping club in Santa Cruz that I joined, and pretty quickly I joined the board of that. And then I'm serving as the president now, and I have on and off for the past 6 years, 8 years, something like that. I've always been on the board or in leadership position with that. And that's really helped kind of grow the community of local beekeepers. And then with the beekeeping work with Napa Valley Bee Company, it was a lot of hive management, but we were also doing hive extractions. We were doing non-grafting methods of queen rearing. So that was kind of, I was learning multiple different ways to raise queens in those regards. And then beyond that, I was also starting to attend a lot more bee meetings and conferences and kind of extending my network there. So for several years, UC Davis has a great beekeeping program. They're a big agricultural school here, and they have a bee lab and are very involved with beekeeping efforts there. They have a master beekeeping program. And for several years, they had a beekeeping symposia that I would attend and kind of get to network with beekeepers through those classes and workshops. And then similarly, at the same time, there's, 2 or 3 other local bee professionals in my area that do queen rearing and hive extraction cutout type work and some hive management type work and raising nukes and all of that. And so I've done a little bit of work with each of those professional beekeepers as well. Not as much as with Napa Valley Bee Company, but I had done kind of like smaller contract work with several other beekeepers. And then in the more recent years, like in the past 3 to 5 years, 5 years or so, I've been attending more of the national and international bee meetings. I've given some presentations at like the American Beekeeping Federation conference, and through attendance and networking at the Appamundia conference, I am part of this national, we call ourselves the Adaptive Bee Breeders Alliance. And so it's several different bee researchers and bee breeders from around the country kind of working in conjunction with each other to do stock selection for queens and sharing information, just kind of like continuing education, but on a more like professional beekeeper level. I do a ton of like through Santa Cruz Bee Company this whole time. I'm talking about kind of these milestones, but throughout this whole time, now this is, I think, the 10th year of my business in Santa Cruz Bee Company. And that is what most of my kind of bread and butter everyday work is. And that's a lot of like mentoring and teaching. So something else I missed from starting almost, 8 or 10 years ago as well, is that I've been teaching beginner beekeeping classes through the community college as well. So yeah, just doing a lot of community education, mentoring new beekeepers, and then kind of fostering and working with beekeepers as they are kind of transitioning from beginner stage to more intermediate, and just meeting the needs of whatever kind of our local beekeeping community is here. In terms of advice that I would give for beekeepers that are kind of just starting out, brand new, first hive, trying to learn the ropes, I usually have like a little checklist in my classes for them to kind of get acquainted with. I always tell them, if possible, find their local bee club or bee association if they have one, because that's usually a really great local resource. I really think that specifically with beekeeping, you can read a book, you can watch videos on YouTube. I feel like sometimes like the online content, if you can actually visually see someone do it, even if it's on a screen. I know for me, I'm kind of like a visual and kinesthetic sort of learner. And so actually learning through doing for me has worked really well. And I think that kind of demonstration is really helpful. So for new beekeepers, if there isn't an Emily in their area that they can hire, there might be a local bee club that has a mentorship program where they kind of connect people that live in the same area. They might have informational meetings once a month or other resources. And beekeeping is definitely very place-based. A beekeeper in Nebraska is going to have different sort of environmental conditions than someone in San Diego, and different from someone that's in Maine, So in terms of kind of what to expect seasonally as they go through the months of beekeeping, that's really helpful. There's some really great resources out there, books you can read. I mean, there's so many, but I really like the Beekeeper's Handbook by Diana Samataro. That's a really good one. And then there's some of the books by Kim Flodham, like The Backyard Beekeeper is really helpful. So I would say published books are really nice. Getting content and information online is great, but it's not necessarily vetted, third party, edited, going through publishing process, all of that. So anything you're going to find, on YouTube or something like that, just know that might just be one person's opinion or experience, and it might not kind of be generally applicable to them. But I think finding resources within your own area is really helpful. And then other kind of just important things. I'm like a huge nerd when it comes to note taking and keeping hive records. For all of my clients, they all have a file. Every time I'm there, I'm taking notes. So then I can look back and say, okay, last time we were in the hive 3 weeks ago, we didn't see any eggs and we saw queen cells. So we think maybe they were about to swarm or had just swarmed. So let's, there's a lot of timeliness and like bee math involved with new beekeeping with things relating to queens. So having good records that you can draw on is really, really valuable. And then just doing some research as well to kind of say like, in my area, what are sort of some of the seasonal benchmarks that I should be looking for in terms of hive management? Are there things that, it's August, probably won't have swarming, but I might have robbing behavior or things like that. So kind of learning what to look for in and around the hive seasonally and kind of what to do to support the bees in different timeframes in terms of monitoring for varroa mite populations or other health issues. And, in each season, there's kind of different things to be looking out for. But yeah, definitely tapping into any kind of local community that you have. If you can have a bee buddy that you kind of go into each other's hives together. Anytime you can have exposure to different additional numbers of beehives, I feel like each of those is a distinct, universe unto itself in a way. So that can be really helpful, I think. So when I'm going somewhere for the first time, kind of my first interaction with a new customer or like, their beehive as, my new study piece that I'm working with. There is sort of a checklist that I'll go through when I'm kind of getting the rundown of that hive's history. So I will usually ask them the age of the hive, like if they're brand new, if it's the first year and it's only been a few months, or if it's overwintered, it's the second year. I will usually ask them if they know the like progeny or genetics of where it's from. So if it was a local nuke that they got from XYZ supplier, or if it was a package from this place, or a swarm that they collected, or the split off of their friend's hive, or that's sometimes helpful for me to know. Additionally, most of the folks that I'm working with have Langstroth style beehives. I do work with a few people that have top bar hives. Some people work with flow hives, which I just think of as Langstroth hives basically, because I end up kind of managing them in similar ways. So then I'll kind of, beyond sort of the history, and then also taking into account what part of my county or area am I in, to kind of draw on that understanding of, okay, well, I know in this area, there's not as much of a honey flow as in this area. This area has more beekeepers, hive density, so there might be more problems with pest issues here than other places. So I'll kind of have that internal dialogue driving what I'm looking for. And then I'm going to be looking for individual things on that hive. So like, do they have a screened bottom for hive monitoring, for varroa mite and other debris monitoring and pest monitoring? Do they have an entrance reducer on, and where is that at? When I'm looking in the hive, like, have they been consistently managing it going in the hive? There's been times where I've gone somewhere and it's like, no one's been in this hive for 5 years and I can't even get it open because it's completely coated in propolis, or the frames are falling apart or whatever. And then there's some new beekeepers that they're like so excited that they're in their hive every 5 days. And I'm like, don't do that. That's too much. The bees don't like that. So, kind of, looking at their equipment setup, same thing, like, do they have a good hive stand? Is it elevated off the ground? Is there a lot of potential problems with, grass growing up onto the hive? Do they have problems with ants or other pests, or, that sort of stuff? So kind of place-based logistical equipment type work. And then also, within the hive, if it was a package that they installed, did they leave a huge space in the middle where they dumped the bees and then didn't put the frames back together? So there's a bunch of crosscomb that we have to clean up, or, you never quite know what you're going to run into. So there's a wide variety and it can be different depending. But yeah, usually kind of like to get the history of the bees, their history of their management. Like sometimes they're like, oh, well, they swarmed 6 months ago and then I bought a queen, or, I'll try to get some of that back history because that helps me know where we're at. One tool that I really love that I learned from my bee mentor up in Napa that isn't super common, but like I got our local bee store to start carrying them because I kept recommending them to people, are follower boards. And so those, like in a top bar hive, you might know it as a false back. You can kind of change the size of the hive. So I use those a lot in my hive management seasonally, as a hive is kind of expanding and contracting in size. you may want to, I find that a lot of times the bees in a Langstroth hive like to have that kind of vertical configuration of staying, with their honey stores above and then brood and pollen below. So if I'm kind of going through the season and I find, there's only, 8 frames out of 12 that they're using, and we're in October and the weather's getting colder, but I don't want to put them all into one box and reduce them and change the configuration. So you can kind of add the follower boards almost like a, if you think of like a double-walled mug that kind of has that insulation of like the inner and the outer walls. So that's a tool that I use a lot and that I recommend kind of, after folks have had the hive for a few months and they're kind of getting in preparation for winter. That's probably the number one thing that I would say is kind of like the non-typical item that I would have them order. Another one is just that a lot of times if there's new beekeepers and they just want to buy a hive kit, which is more simple in a lot of ways for them because it comes with all the necessary components. One thing I've really run into and always reiterate with new beekeepers when they're buying the Langstroth equipment is there are 8-frame hives and 10-frame hives. And if you're buying all the separate components, you have to make sure that you get all of them in the correct size. So I've definitely had beekeepers say, oh, I ordered a lid, but it's a 10-frame lid and I have an 8-frame box or vice versa. So a lot of times the hive kits only come with a solid hive bottom, a solid wood bottom. And I really like to use the screened hive bottoms. The approach that I have come from kind of my teaching, my lineage, and the way that I prefer to manage hives is without using any mite treatments if possible. That's really been my whole philosophy and I really stick to that. Obviously, there's times where it might be necessary, but using some of these tools for mite monitoring, particularly the screened hive bottom, if you can pull that debris tray from underneath the screened bottom and do a visual check for varroa mite, that also helps me when I'm working with new beekeepers. I can say, hey, this little tiny maroon dot on my finger that looks like, a tick or whatever, that's a varroa mite. So learn what they look like. We pull the tray after, doing a 24-hour check and we say, oh, there's only 3 mites. That's not bad. If you pull it after 24 hours and there's 150 mites, you might need to do something to address that issue. So, that's a really important tool that I would say definitely for kind of that seasonal management. Those pieces of equipment I often will have beekeepers purchase, after their initial hive kit. So when I give presentations at conferences and to different bee clubs, oftentimes the most valuable information that I'm giving to those emerging beekeepers is kind of related to, I guess, like what we can learn from the bees. It's not entirely obvious what I might mean in that regard, but I really think that the bees can really be our teacher in the way that they almost always do everything better than we do. In terms of their own systems and management. So one of my, pieces of information I give to new beekeepers is, in addition to like find your mentor or take notes, find your local bee club, do research, read books. The last piece of advice is if you see something and you don't know what to do, don't do anything. Just close the hive and come back later. Because one of the biggest lessons that I've learned is by taking an action that I think at the time is right, and then it ends up being this catastrophe and failure. And failure is our greatest teacher. So it's through those mistakes that we really remember those mistakes the most, and they end up really being very informative for future times. But, particularly a lot of the presentations that I've given over the years, because so much of my work has been around queen rearing and like bee reproduction and, basically requeening hives, working with queen bees, understanding kind of the genetics and kind of evolution of hives over time and adaptive traits, all those sorts of things. Queen bees, not every queen is the same. Not every queen is created equally, and queen quality can really vary a lot. And so, like I was saying, let the bees be our teachers and kind of let them sort of be the guide. So often I've found that if you leave a colony alone, you could introduce a queen and that might work well. But sometimes if you do nothing, the colony will be able to sort itself out on its own. It might be able to get queen right on its own if you just give it a little bit more time. And that's not always the case. Obviously, you have to follow flow, the understanding of the timelines and what they're capable of with what material they have in the hive. And that takes knowledge and experience to understand that. But generally speaking, think like a bee when you're doing your beekeeping. Think about, if I were a bee, what would I want in this situation? Would I want someone coming in and changing all these things around, or would I want them to have a really light touch and just sort of do a little bit more observation and a little bit less harsh management or changes? So for anyone new that's starting out, a great tip that I will give them if they have any family members that are still living that had been doing beekeeping before, like picking their brain about kind of tips and advice or anything if they wanted to do it together, that's great. I pretty much tell most of the new folks that I'm working with, if at all possible, if they have the space, if they have the resources, it's really great to get 2 beehives because the loss rate of honeybees is so unfortunately high. Annual loss hovers around 50%. Even in the best case scenario, if you have 1 hive, it's like a 50-50 chance that they might not survive that first year. So getting 2 hives not only gives you that added kind of insurance of, if you lose one, at least you still have the other. You can also, if you need to share resources between hives, that's really valuable. Obviously you don't always want to do that if there's any concern of one hive being sick, anything like that. Also, if they're brand new, you don't want to take away resources from a hive if they're still developing. But sometimes you run into a situation where you're like, oh, this one hive suddenly doesn't have a queen. If I could give them some eggs and brood from this hive, maybe they could right themselves. So there's the resource sharing aspect of that. But also, like to my point earlier where I was talking about getting in multiple hives and having multiple kind of data points to learn from, you can have 2 hives and they're in the same environment and they're same, pretty similar genetic profile. You're managing them the same way. And there can be vastly different situations going on in those hives. Like you can have one that is like 3 boxes tall and has like 10 frames of gorgeous brood and like honey stores and looks perfect. And then the other one, you're like, well, I see a queen and they have brood, but it looks kind of spotty. And some of these cells look like maybe they're drone cells in worker comb. And I don't know, is this queen going to make it? And is she just kind of learning how to lay? Or, there's all these different situations you can run into. And if you only have 1 hive, that's going to be your whole knowledge base. So if you can, I am hesitant to tell people get 6 hives, 10 hives. Obviously, there's an expense there and there's a time and space consideration there. But I also, a lot of my work, I haven't talked about the great Dr. Thomas Seeley yet, but he's like my favorite living bee researcher. And he wrote Honeybee Democracy and The Lives of Bees. And he has this whole kind of approach that he came up with that he calls Darwinian beekeeping. And it basically talks about kind of the environment of evolutionary adaptedness of bees and how they kind of have historically lived in the wild, in nature over millennia, and how the current, kind of more commercial, mainstream, conventional management of hives is. And a really big one is hive density in an area for hive health. So I always, I've had a lot of beekeepers that got really excited and suddenly they have 6 hives all right next to each other in one area. And, it might be great in May, but come October, November, they might just be, getting robbed out or having really bad drift and mite problems. And, so I think that's also really important for the new beekeeper. Words of encouragement and, kind of the next steps on your journey is just to, really stay curious. There's this whole universe inside the beehive, and there's so much that we can learn from the bees about teamwork, about, altruism and, working together, and just the kind of a loyalty and just the beauty of the superorganism, I personally find really inspiring. So I would just say continue to be inspired and in awe of the wonders of honeybees, but all of nature, really.